All right, everybody, let's get started. Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to the Lunchtime Discovery Series. It's great to be with you again for another edition of our weekly program brought to you by the North Carolina Office of Environmental Education within the Department of Environmental Quality here in the state of North Carolina, and broadcast and hosted by us here at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. I am your host. My name is Chris Smith. I'm the coordinator for current science programs, and it is my pleasure and privilege to get to be with you folks just about every Wednesday at noon for the Lunchtime Discovery Series. We get to meet really interesting people who are doing great, interesting, important work across science and nature and education every week. So I hope that you've got this program marked on your calendars so that you can come and join us every Wednesday at noon, take in this great program, meet and hear from interesting people. And of course, one of the great things about the Lunchtime Discovery Series is that, we're here in the studio, we're live streaming out to you on YouTube or Facebook, wherever you happen to be watching, but this program is interactive. That's right. I want everybody who's watching to be able to participate. If you've got thoughts, questions, comments about today's topic for our guest speakers, make sure that you're dropping those into the chat box on YouTube or the comments on Facebook. I will be looking to you for questions when we get to the end of the presentations. So make sure that you're queuing those up for me. That way we can have a great discussion about today's topic. And speaking of today's topic, it looks like we're going to be talking about sort of, like the rock stars of ponds, lakes, rivers, and streams the world over. That's right. We're going to be talking about algae. I don't know if anybody has ever referred to algae as rock stars of the world's waterways, but I see our guests. They're just like, yes, we've got a champion in algae. Let me bring on today's guests. Now, both of today's presenters work for the Division of Water Resources within the Department of Environmental Quality, NCDEQ. First, I want everybody to say hi and hello to Elizabeth Fensin. Elizabeth is an algal ecologist with DEQ. Hi, Elizabeth.
Hello. I adore the Museum of Natural Sciences, so I am really excited to talk about y'all today and about algae. Thank you.
Well, we're excited to talk to you too. Thank you. That's awesome. And then after Elizabeth, we'll hear from Dan Wiltsie, and Dan is DEQ's Algal Bloom Response Coordinator. Hi, Dan.
Hi, Chris. Thank you. Nice to be here today.
Really appreciate both of you joining us today, putting in the time for it. And I'm going to say, let's get into it. Let's learn a little bit about algae in North Carolina.
Cool. Okay. Now, hi all. My name is Elizabeth. I know all sorts of stuff about algae, but I'm not the most technical person in the world, so I hope this all works. I have been working for the Division of Water Resources for 25 years now. All of those years been studying algae in the lakes and rivers and ponds of North Carolina. I spend most of my time in the lab, so I'm very excited to be able to talk to y'all today. So hopefully this works. Wait, I just muted myself. Okay, so I hope this works. It doesn't seem to be working.
Although now we can't hear you.
Okay. Well, okay, I don't know if you got that, but just in short, I have been studying algae for 25 years now with the Division of Water Resources. I spend most of my time in the lab. I'm not the most technically proficient, but I know all sorts of stuff about the biology and ecology of algae. And I don't get to talk about it much, so I'm excited. Okay, so the Algae Lab is part of the Water Sciences section in Raleigh. We have staff in regional offices from the Department of Environmental Quality.
You muted yourself.
Oh, not again. Oh, okay, that's what you mean. Okay, sure. Can you still hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Somebody said I was muted. Okay, so
we're all good.
All right. People in regional offices across the state go out and they collect all sorts of water quality samples to figure out what's going on in our environment. Some of those samples are algae. During the summer, Dan and I go to the chemistry lab every morning to collect any algae samples that have been collected the day before. We bring these algae samples to our lab, we stick them under the microscopes, and we record everything that we see. We have over 20 years of consistent algae data to find out what's normal and what's not normal about the algae of North Carolina. And it blanked again on me. For some reason I hit, okay, let's see if this works. When I hit my arrow key, it mutes on me. Okay, and then Zoom slideshow. All right. Okay, so algae are a lot like plants. They're just goopier. They don't have roots and stems and leaves the way plants do, but they do love light and heat and nutrients. And of course, summer is the growing season for plants. It's also the growing season for algae. The algae are good for food for animals and humans. Algae have been around for billions of years. Most algae just, photosynthesize in the water and mind their own business. They produce food and shelter for bugs and the fish that eat bugs and for very little fish. And of course, when they photosynthesize like other plants, they're producing oxygen. And so they're helping us to breathe. An algal bloom, I tell people, an algal bloom is more like a state of mind because there is no one universal definition of an algal bloom. For us at Division of Water Resources, we drew a line in the water and we said, okay, we're going to call an algal bloom 10,000 units per mil or 5,000 micrometers cubed per meter cubed for biovolume or biomass in terms of mass of algae. And if somebody goes out and puts their dissolved oxygen meter into the water and they find 110% saturation of oxygen or the pH is 8 or above, we know that a lot of algae is out there photosynthesizing, is blooming, so to speak, so people collect samples and they send them to us. And of course, if you see green water, that may very well be an algal bloom, but we get a lot of samples that do not contain algae, but no one else knows what to do with them, so they just give them to us. I've had samples full of pollen, full of white stringy bacteria, fungi, foam on the water, oil in the water, very tiny plants. Every so often we get something like the water smells funny, so somebody goes out and collects a sample and sends it to us. Sometimes when plants photosynthesize during the day, they're producing oxygen, but at night plants do something called respiration and they pull oxygen out of the air or out of the water. And of course, when algae respire and break down, that uses up all the oxygen in the water, and any fish that are stuck in the wrong place at the wrong time, can be smothered. Okay, so are algal blooms increasing? Of course, that's the big question of the hour, and no one really knows. I mean, it's sort of like if a tree falls in the forest, does anybody hear it? In order to know when algal bloom is taking place, you have to be out there looking at the water, testing the water, putting your meter in the water to record the dissolved oxygen. And by terms of definition that we have for density and biomass, algal blooms are occurring all summer, every year. And, but it's just more people are aware of algal blooms, so more people are looking on the water, more people are looking out for it, and so more people are talking to us. So in order for there to be an algal bloom, you have to have somebody out there reporting it and writing it down. And of course, more awareness, more people with phones in their cameras in their phones. We used to not really get any pictures of algal blooms. So now we get lots of pictures of algal blooms, which is great. So if you see an algal bloom, send us a picture. We love pictures. So the more you know about algal blooms, the more you're going to find them. One type of green water that's not an algal bloom is duckweed. And it's also called watermeal or wolfia. They're little tiny plants with only one leaf and no root, so to speak. And they're found in quiet or slow waters, often in ponds and lakes during the spring. And of course, people don't like looking at green water, but duckweed blooms are harmless. It'll go away, it will be fine. And of course, send us a sample because those are cool. Green algal blooms are some of my favorite blooms because they are harmless. They're big and thick and goopy, so you can pick them up with your hands. We see them a lot in the spring. They do most of their reproduction during the spring, and they look really cool under the microscope when they're reproducing. And we'll see these in freshwater lakes and ponds. And I love bringing green algal blooms to elementary schools because that's when I do a lot of Earth Day presentations. And the kids might go, "Ew, green algae," but then they love to play with it. So just, if you see a green algal bloom during the spring, send it to me. I love it. Winter dinoflagellate blooms. Of course, most algae blooms take place during the summer, but some dinoflagellates like it when it's cold. And they tend to happen in coastal waters, which are salty. They can turn the water pink or orange or brown. One DWQ or DWR person who went out several years ago on the New River in Onslow County said she felt like she was in the middle of a giant strawberry daiquiri because all the water was pink. And she sent me a sample full of dinoflagellates. And so I had fun. She had fun. I don't know what anybody else thought about the pink water, but there you go. Okay, and of course, summertime is our crunch time. That's when algae are really growing. Rain, well, like thunderstorms we have, rain washes nutrients into the water, such as especially nitrogen, phosphorus, into the water. The sunlight will heat up a few days after the thunderstorm when you've got nice, quiet water. It's warm, it's bright sunlight, and the algae, it's prime conditions for an algal bloom. So you're going to find algal blooms during the summer. One type of bloom that we get a lot during the summer are Eukanoid blooms, Euglena, Trichomonas, stuff like that. Surface blooms of Euglena can look like green or red paint on the water, and Euglena really like poop, so to speak. And we'll often find blooms that are green and red around cows or chickens or stuff like that. But if you see a red or green Euglena bloom and you can't find any poop, so to speak, you might still have some wastewater pollution out there. I've seen one or two academic articles that red Euglena blooms might be toxic, but I'm not convinced. I would be more concerned about the actual poop that's fueling that bloom than the actual Euglena. Okay, Cyanobacteria blooms, also known as blue-green algal blooms. These are very common during summer because cyanobacteria is just good at outcompeting everybody else during the summer. They've been an ordinary part of the environment for billions of years. They've been recorded in North Carolina since the 1980s. They've probably been around before in the 1980s, but that's when what was then the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, that's when they started actually writing down algal bloom occurrences in the 80s. And some cyanobacteria species have strains which produce toxins. Most cyanobacteria do not. Most cyanobacteria are just minding their own business. But of course, the ones that produce toxin get all the attention. And reports of toxic cyanobacteria have been increasing worldwide. No one really knows why. The Environmental Protection Agency thinks maybe it's because waters are becoming fresher and warmer, and that's leading to more cyanobacteria blooms maybe. If you see a cyanobacteria bloom that's been around for a while and it hasn't gone anywhere and it just starts to rot, it'll look blue. That's what the picture in the corner is supposed to represent. The Chowan River in the northeastern part of the state, they've been having cyanobacteria blooms since 2015 every summer, and we really don't know why, even though there have been university labs across the state who are looking into this. So we hope we find out what's going on, but usually we'll have blooms of potentially toxic cyanobacteria every summer. I've been here since the late 90s. I've seen potentially toxic blooms of cyanobacteria every summer in stereo, every summer, and they really don't cause any problems, so to speak. I mean, it's just relatively recently, I guess people are more aware, and so people get more worried about it. Hans Perl at the Institute of Marine Sciences in Morehead City came up with cute nicknames for some of the more common potentially toxic cyanobacteria. He calls them Annie, Fanny, Mike, Cindy, and Linda. And I'll see a lot of blooms of Anabena, Aphanizomenon, and Cylindrospermopsis every summer in freshwaters in North Carolina. I'm looking at them right now. If I wasn't giving this presentation, I'd be counting Cylindrospermopsis. But there you go. These are very, very common. Anyway, okay, another type of common cyanobacteria that we find is Lingbia Wooly Eye, also called a Microcystis or Linda. It's also known as black mat algae. You can pick it up and throw it, even though I would not recommend it because it also has a reputation for irritating skin. So if you see this growing along the edge of a nutrient-rich lake, Don't play with it. Of course, call us up and let us know what's going on. So it might produce toxins. Microcystis, also known as Mike, it's been very well known. Microcystis has been tracked for years by the World Health Organization, but it hasn't been that common in North Carolina until 2009. And no one really knows why, of course, but that's around 2009, that's when the EPA started to say that blooms of Microcystis are becoming more common in the US Southeast. Not sure why. They grow cyanobacteria like low salinity rivers like the Chowan River, but they really like lakes and rivers that have no salt in them. Microcystis blooms can look like green surface water, but a lot of times Microcystis will look patchy. That's why I have this picture here. And sometimes they're even known as looking like green flecks or grass clippings. There were several years ago, it was before 2009, there was a golf course and somebody said, oh, they're dumping their grass clippings in the ponds. And my colleague and I said, grass clippings? And we went out, we took pictures like, yep, fortunately, no grass clippings, but lots of Microcystis. And of course, we were probably the only ones who were happy about that because we think that kind of thing's exciting. So of course, Microcystis is potentially toxic. So if you see something like green flecks or green patches in the water, try to stay out of it. Of course, our website for general information and information on information sheets for algae, algae.nc.gov. I've got my contact information there, Dan's contact information. I can tell you all about the ecology and biology of algae, but if you have questions about health concerns or toxins, please contact Kennedy Holt at the Division of Public Health with the Department of Human Services. He's your guy for that. Anything but general algae questions, ask me. So now I'm going to hand you over to Dan, who will tell you what to do if you see an algal bloom. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Elizabeth. Let's see here. I'm going to share my screen. All right. Okay. So as Chris and Elizabeth mentioned, I'm the Algal Bloom Response Coordinator for NCDEQ. And so I'm going to be talking today about what you should do when you see an algal bloom and how to report it, and then how we here at DEQ go ahead and investigate those blooms. And so, we've been kind of talking about the different organisms that can create a bloom. And so now we're going to look more at the bloom itself, what that does in the environment. And so, Elizabeth went over several different types of algae that can cause these blooms, but today I'm going to be focusing my talk on cyanobacteria. Again, that's the blue-green algae. These are the ones that are becoming more common, not only here in North Carolina, but around the world, and that are leading to issues all over the world. And so some of the effects of algal blooms include, as Elizabeth mentioned, low dissolved oxygen levels in the water, leading to fish kills. They can block sunlight to submerged aquatic vegetation, or SAV. They can also outcompete other algae for resources, including nutrients, space, sunlight. And then, just thinking about having a bloom in the water, this green surface on the top of the water, it can lead to recreational, economic, and aesthetic losses to your system. And as Elizabeth mentioned, some can produce toxins. We'll talk about that next. And then some can also be dermal irritants. So the DHHS, Department of Health and Human Services, has a little saying that says, when in doubt, stay out. And so this basically means if you come to a water body, it's got any kind of green coloration or something just doesn't look right, it's always just best to stay out. They also have some tips to remember to avoid any potential adverse health effects if you come into contact with an algal bloom. And so these include, again, staying out of water that appears scummy or has some kind of surface or discoloration. Any kind of dead fish that might be in the area, just avoid handling those. If you come into contact with an algal bloom, either a human or a pet, make sure to wash them off with clean water thoroughly after being in the bloom. And then finally, if any humans or animals or pets have any kind of adverse symptoms, appear ill, staggering, anything like that after being in water, it's important to seek medical attention as soon as possible. And so again, cyanotoxins, these are going to be toxins that are produced by cyanobacteria. And so I have 4 of some of the more common cyanotoxins shown here on this slide. There are many more toxin types than these, but these are some of the more common ones that we see. And you can notice that they have different forms, and these different forms obviously lead to different health effects in humans and animals. And so some of these health effects can be liver, nervous system effects, cell function disruption. Currently at DWR, we only have the resources to test for microcystin, the one I have highlighted up in the top right. This is the most common and well-studied cyanotoxin, but again, it's just important to remember that there are other toxins that can be present. And so one of the issues with these cyanotoxins is that, one genera of cyanobacteria can produce multiple toxins. So I have this table on the right, the genus of cyanobacteria on the left, and the toxins that they can produce on the right. And you can see, of these 5 common cyanobacteria that I've listed here, 4 of them are able to produce more than one toxin. It's important to remember, though, that just because you have one of these potentially toxic genera in your water body, that does not necessarily mean that toxins are being produced. So toxin production is variable. There's a lot of research going on to figure out what organisms produce it, what toxins they actually produce, when they produce it. Is it environmental? Does it have something to do with competition or predation? So there's a lot of research going on with that. You can't tell just by looking at a bloom out in the environment if it's toxic or not. You have to run specific analytical tests on it to get that kind of information. And then the other thing is just to remember that water treatment plants have very robust methods in place for removing algae and toxins from drinking water before it goes out to the public. So this flowchart shows kind of our bloom response from getting a report in either from residents or our staff when they're out doing their routine sampling. That leads to sample collection by our staff. Samples are shipped and acquired here and in Raleigh at our central offices. Samples are analyzed. We interpret that data, write up our reports, and then, if necessary, do more follow-up investigation by going out and collecting more samples. And so that first thing, is the reporting. So again, we either get reports in from residents or staff. In the past, most of these have come from either phone calls or emails to regional offices or to the central lab. That can certainly still be done, but our new method that we have in place is our online dashboard. And so this was developed a couple years ago to allow citizens to easily report and track algal blooms across the state. And so it has 2 different components. The first one is a citizen reporting form, which is a Survey 123 form. I have the link here, but also if you just go onto algae.nc.gov, our webpage has all these links and more information on blooms there. But I have a screenshot here on the right of the top of that reporting form, and it's just a short form. It just takes a few minutes to fill out. You can enter your name, phone number, email. Let us know if it's a fish kill or algal bloom event. So this reporting form and the dashboard are both for fish kill and algal blooms. We just combine them into one system, but I'll just be focusing on the algal blooms today. And so on that report, or on the reporting form at the bottom, it has a section that allows you to enter information in, to write out what the bloom looks like, what you saw, any other kind of conditions happening at the time of the bloom, which really helps to give us more information about the bloom to see what you saw when you're first reporting it. There's also a section for you to upload a picture, which is helpful because that allows us, sometimes we can just look at that picture and tell the relative group that the algae is, if it's a cyanobacteria or green algae, et cetera. And then there's also a section that has a map that you can put your exact location in. You can upload your coordinates so that we can get an exact location of where that bloom event occurred. And so the second part of the dashboard the second part of our reporting system is once those reporting forms are submitted, those automatically get uploaded to our dashboard, which is an ArcGIS application. We'll talk about that more in the next slide. Again, that website, the link to that is on our website, algae.nc.gov. In 2021, we had 144 reports sent in on our dashboard. 95 of those were algal bloom reports, and total as of this morning, we had 365 reports. Again, both algae and fish kills on our dashboard, and 252 of those were specifically for algal blooms. And so this is a screenshot of the dashboard itself. Again, this is a public-facing application. The public can go on and look at where we've had reports of blooms and fish kills all across the state. These widgets along the side will change depending on where you are on the map. You can zoom into a certain water body if you're concerned about a certain area, and it will show all the reports for that area. If you click on the report either from the list on the left or the specific symbol on the map itself, a little pop-up window will come up, and it will show you, when that report was submitted, where it was submitted, all the user entered information for it. Once we have all of our information and we go back in and update this dashboard for specific reports, then we enter our analysis, what kind of algae we found, if we found toxins, if we have an actual written report to submit, we'll also have that on the dashboard that the public can then go in and download and just read some more information about the bloom if they're interested in it. So if you're interested in the blooms or fish kills across the state, I'd encourage you to go on here. This is usually the first place we send folks whenever they ask us if blooms are occurring in a certain location around the state. We try to keep it up to date as much as we can, but as Elizabeth mentioned, summertime is our crunch time, and so we have a lot of bloom reports coming in. And so again, we just try to get those updated as soon as possible. One other thing I just want to point out is that you can notice on this map, this isn't an issue that's, relegated to one part of the state. This is from the mountains to the coast. Both fish kills and bloom events. So again, it's not just one area that's experiencing these events. All right, so we get a report in. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to reach out to our field staff at our regional offices. They're the ones who go out and collect samples for us. They're also very busy. They have other things that they need to do sometimes where they're not able to get out and collect samples. If not, we at least have that note on the dashboard saying that an algal bloom has occurred here, but we do make every effort possible to get out and collect samples for these reports. And so they'll go out to the location, they'll collect different samples. All these bottles here are for the different types of samples that need to be collected for these blooms, as well as field parameters, so things like dissolved oxygen, pH, water temperature. Some samples need specific preservatives, as you can see here. Those samples then, when they're done collecting them, they'll put them on ice and then ship them here again to our central labs here in Raleigh. These samples are analyzed for algal community composition via microscopy, toxin presence and concentration. We also look for nutrients and chlorophyll. So what happens is that when we get the sample in, we'll pick up the samples, we'll take them and look at them under the microscope. If we find potentially toxic producing species in there, then we're going to start running a test strip for that. And so these test strips, you can see in the top right here, this picture is the kit that we have that tests for these toxins. Again, we can only test for microcystin. So if we find potentially microcystin producing species, we're going to start this test strip process. These are very rapid tests. You can get results in about 45 minutes using one of these. But unfortunately, we only use them for qualitative purposes. So to tell us whether toxins are present or not in the sample, there is a way to determine a relative toxin concentration, but it's very subjective. So we only use it to really say whether toxins are present or not. And so if toxins are present, then we'll let our chemistry lab know, and then they'll be able to follow follow that up with a more robust testing method, and that's using ELISA, which stands for Enzyme Linked Immunosorbent Assay. This machine on the bottom of the screen is what they use to test for these. And essentially what this is it's just a process that uses color change as a proxy for toxin concentration. And so they'll put their sample in, and this machine is completely automated. A few hours later, they'll get the results back. And so this is a lot longer wait time than our strict tests. The test takes several hours plus a day or two of prep time, which includes freezing and thawing the sample, which helps to rupture the cells to get the toxins out of the cell and into the water. But the good thing about this is that we can then get a quantitative concentration of microcystin. And so this is in micrograms per liter. That's what the EPA and the World Health Organization uses for their different standards and guidelines. And so this helps us to get an actual microcystin concentration that we can then compare to these guidelines. So after we get, we do our microscopy analysis, we do toxin analysis. Once we get all of the information in, as I mentioned, we'll write a report, update the dashboard with all of our results. If a bloom has occurred in a highly populated or recreated area, or it's a high toxin concentration, then we'll issue a press release. Sometimes we also do this at the beginning of the investigation if it's deemed necessary. Anytime we have a press release issued, we work closely with NCDHHS to make sure that the information that we're getting out is as accurate as possible, that we know it to be at that time. And that's just because that we are only an environmental agency. We don't have the ability to issue any kind of advisory or beach closure or anything. That's DHHS. That's their domain. So if a public health concern is present, then the DHHS will work with the local health department to begin an investigation. Again, they're going to be the ones who are able to issue a closure or an advisory, put up signs at the location to warn folks to stay out of the water. We're not usually involved in that process, again, only to be brought on as the algal experts. And then finally, if necessary, if the bloom is long lasting, we'll continue monitoring it. Again, that's dependent on the bloom severity, any weather, because a lot of times storms will come through. So a lot of wind and wave action can actually help to flush these blooms, not only out of the area that they were originally found in, but if enough rain or wind is coming through in a storm, that can also just flush the bloom completely out of the system that it's in. So a lot of the times we'll go the next day or a few days later, and there's no hint of a bloom, and that's because the storm had come through a couple of days earlier. And again, it depended on staff resource availability. And so I wanted to take a few minutes to just go through a few bloom reports that have come in over the past couple of years. These are areas that either have had issues in the past or are becoming more nuisance areas, and that we're beginning to do more long-term monitoring in. And so Elizabeth mentioned the Chowan River. Again, this is in the northeastern part of the state. Blooms have been occurring in the area since about 2015 every summer. Last year, we had 14 reports just on the river itself. These were mostly dominated by Microcystis and Delicospermum, which are two types of cyanobacteria. We also got more reports in smaller creeks and ponds in the area, as well as reports in Perquimans, Little, and Pasquotank rivers, which are the rivers closer to the coast out that way. Samples that were collected in July of last year contained 350 parts per billion or micrograms per liter of microcystin, leading us to issue a press release. And so just for context, the EPA's recreational health guideline for microcystin is only 8. And so this was much higher than that recommended guideline. And then we collaborate out that way with the Chowan Edenton Environmental Group. And they're kind of just, our ears and eyes on the ground. They're the ones who alert us to a lot of these blooms out in that area. And this just really points to the impact and the importance of citizen scientists on bloom monitoring, because, there's many water bodies, rivers, lakes, ponds all across the state, and we can't have eyes on all of these blooms or all of these areas all the time. And so having folks there realizing when there's an issue, a bloom in the area, and letting us know about it is the best way that we can help to, again, begin this investigation process and get the answers that they need. So another one is Lake Wylie. This is a system on the North Carolina-South Carolina border that's south of Charlotte. Historically, there have not been many bloom issues in this lake, but last year, in late July, early August, we began to get reports of blooms in the lake. Again, these were dominated by cyanobacteria, so Microcystis and Cyanobacteria. We were out a few times to collect samples. We at DWR, we did not detect any microcystin, but South Carolina was out there and detected it at concentrations above 10 parts per billion. Again, the EPA recommended health guideline is 8, so it's just slightly above that. But this was a really cool bloom in the fact that it began this really great ongoing collaborative stakeholders group that are looking into, why this occurred, continue monitoring this year, and then trying to get information out to the public to let them know about blooms, just to make them more aware, just because, again, blooms hadn't occurred in this area before. And so a lot of the folks weren't sure what to do in that situation. And so this group includes not only DWR, but Charlotte-Mecklenburg Stormwater Services, South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control, or DHEC, Duke Energy, the Catawba River Keepers, North Carolina DHHS. I think we have a few more groups in there now. I know there are local health departments involved. And so just a lot of really smart people on this group trying to help to figure out why this is occurring. So the last bloom issue that I want to go in is on Lake Gaston. This is on the North Carolina-Virginia border. This lake has had hydrilla issues in the past, which is an invasive or nuisance aquatic weed. Successful management led to the decrease of the hydrilla in that system. But as soon as that went out, another group or another organism came in and took its place. And so this was Microcera, former Lingbia or black mat algae. Again, this is cyanobacteria, even though it doesn't really look like it, what we've seen, so far. But they form these benthic mats on the bottom of the water. They're thick and they're smelly. They have a really unique musty smell. A lot of the times, though, these blooms can become detached from the bottom and float to the surface, and that's when you get issues like you can see in this picture here. Now, because they're thick and filamentous, they're really difficult to manage and to test for toxins. And so a lot of the cyanobacteria research in the past has been on the phytoplankton, which is what we've been talking about. These are the algae that are free floating in the water itself and not, a benthic mat like this. So there's a lot more research now that's looking at these benthic mats and trying to figure out the best way to analyze them and to test them for toxins. And so not only us here, the DWR Algae program, we have our aquatic weed program, other academic researchers at North Carolina State and Old Dominion, state agencies here in North Carolina and Virginia are working on collaboration to try to help to mitigate some of these Microcera issues. I want to take a minute to also talk about climate change. And so this is obviously a big topic, a big hot button issue right now. And a lot of folks are asking, is climate change related to algal blooms? And so I used information that was presented in the North Carolina Climate Science Report that was published in 2020. And I pulled out some information from that is related to algal blooms. And so some of their findings, one was that it is very likely that temperatures will increase in North Carolina in all seasons. And so, to highlight this point, June of 2020 was the driest in more than 30 years and potentially the second driest since 1895. And you can see in the bottom right, I pulled this image from the North Carolina Drought Management Advisory Council. This shows the drought map on the state beginning of July, end of June. And you can see that almost the entire state was under some kind of drought advisory at that time. The climate science report also found that it was very likely that the number of warm and very warm nights will increase. And then they also found that it was likely that severe droughts will be more frequent and intense. Now, if you remember, the things that algae need to create these blooms are mostly nutrients, increased sunlight and warm temperatures, and then slow water flow. And so all of these predictions for North Carolina in the future point to the fact that, it's likely that we'll see the right conditions for bloom formation to continue in the future. Now, right now, it's difficult for us to point to one specific event and say climate change undoubtedly created that. But again, it's just showing that in the future, it's likely that we'll continue to see these. And so just quickly looking forward to what's next for us. Again, our main thing is just analyzing routine and episodic algal samples. We'll continue to do that. Collaborate with other groups on known problem areas. So again, some of those lakes that I mentioned, other areas that we have groups working on, promoting our dashboard and reporting system through social media, newspapers, et cetera, and helping to kind of streamline that process a little bit more. Again, this is only a couple of years old, so we're still working on editing it and making it easier for folks to use. Including new methods for sampling and analyzing as they become available, as research continues and there are better methods for doing all of this, we'll kind of try to incorporate those as we can into our program. One thing, this kind of feeding into the climate change aspect is looking at yearly trends of blooms in certain areas and determining if blooms are increasing or becoming more prevalent in certain areas. And then also just working to educate the public on what algae and blooms are through, presentations like this. I think that education is one of the main things that can really help to help folks know, again, what algae are and how to protect themselves and their family and pets from the harmful effects that blooms can have. All right, and so that's my part of the presentation. I just want to thank everyone again for giving us the opportunity to talk. Our contact information is here. Again, algae.nc.gov if you have any questions. Thank you.
Dan, thank you. And thanks to you as well, as Elizabeth, for sharing so much awesome information about algae with us. Glad to have you both here. And my goodness, there's a lot to know and learn about algae in North Carolina. I'm really impressed with it. Viewers, I hope you are too. Make sure that if you've got questions or comments that you drop them in the chat or in the comments on Facebook. We'll be getting to your questions in just a moment. But to get started, Elizabeth, I wanted to go back to you and maybe get a couple of questions in about specifically like algae biology. Like how long do some of these algae actually persist in the environment? Like, from does an algae live for, half a day and then it's reproduced and it's done and it's dead and it's a dead algae, or is it a lot longer?
Okay. Before the Chowan River blooms in 2015, I would say, a bloom just lasts until the sun goes down and then it goes away. And then if the sun comes back up and there isn't a storm and conditions are favorable, it could just come back. It's no big deal. Usually I'll say like a bloom would probably go away after a few days. The Chowan River situation is different because people who live along the river, when they started to report blooms, the blooms just would not leave, or wind action would push a bloom from one end of the river to the other end. And that's unusual. A bloom should go away after a few hours or a few days, but sometimes you can just have a very persistent situation. So of course, the situation is always changing. We're always learning more things about algae. I would say if everything is normal, things would go away after a few hours or a few days.
Okay, interesting. I don't know. I had this perception that like an algal bloom is just persistent in a lake or a pond just all summer long, but I suppose that's incorrect. I think of a pond as being covered in like green slime all the time, no matter what. But that's incorrect.
Well, in a pond, I guess you could have a very stagnant situation where the algae just don't go anywhere for a while, but because there's no wave action or anything like that. Now, of course, under the surface of the water, the algae are going constantly. But just when we look at numerically that the 10,000 units per mil or 5,000 micrometers cubed per meters cubed, that would go on all summer. But that's not the kind of algal bloom that people usually worry about.
Okay, I see. And in coming up with those thresholds for what makes an algal bloom and what doesn't, what were the considerations for drawing those lines? Because you said they were kind of difficult to draw.
Unfortunately, a colleague started, the Bloom program was started back in the mid 80s before myself and other people started joining the program. And we started asking around, and those numbers were pretty much just pulled out of the air because we just decided we needed some sort of threshold. Those numbers were made up. I don't know what considerations went into them, but when we've shared the numbers with other people, no one has told us, oh, that's terrible, you should be using this. There's no actual threshold number that no one actually agrees on. So those are just the numbers that we have used historically.
Okay, interesting. And I guess it's helpful to have, like Dan, the dashboard tool that you were talking about and the ability for anyone to be able to report algae, because then you can analyze it, but you can also look at it and be like, okay, you've got a ton of data available to be able to make decisions and recommendations.
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned, this is just a couple of years old, but we've received a lot of reports on it, and we're really happy with the amount of use that it's gotten. And exactly as you mentioned, we haven't had a chance yet, but one of the things that we plan to do is use that data on there to try to figure out trends and problem areas and see maybe where historically there haven't been issues that are becoming more issues, or maybe there might be areas that have had issues in the past that are becoming less bloomy.
Excellent. Okay, one more from me, and then I'm going to go to the questions that are coming up right now in the chat, which is that given the passion that you both speak of algae, I imagine that you've got to have like memorable algae blooms in your mind. Maybe not, maybe I'm exaggerating, but like I talk to a lot of people doing this program, and I meet a lot of people here at the museum, and folks, I could say, name a memorable hurricane, and everybody goes, oh gosh, North Carolina, Fran. Everybody remembers Fran. So I'm wondering, is there like an algae bloom in North Carolina? You're like, oh, everybody remembers Annie from 2012.
Well, basically for me, it's like I'm not a very outdoorsy person. I can like pretty much just commune with my microscope, and other people around the state go out and they do things, so you probably have to ask them. I do remember a very long time ago in the early 90s, I went out with one of the regional offices on the Pasquotank River and the Perquimans River, and I saw my first algal bloom. I had heard all about algal blooms in graduate school, and it was in just sort of like this little residential canal that looked like there were normal houses on either side, but instead of a street, it was a canal, and there was algae floating on the water, and I touched it. I'm like, oh, this is so cool. I'm seeing that. So I guess you never forget your first algal bloom. So that was mine. Also, once we went to give a presentation for the people in Edenton on the Chowan River, and we drove around the day before, and we found some of those blooms, in person. So, and of course, those golf course ponds that I told you about, where we saw the grass clippings that were actually algal blooms, those were very exciting.
Right, of course.
Yeah, and so I've only been in this position for a couple of years, so I haven't been out in the field enough yet to see a bloom, in this capacity. But I think just, we've talked a lot about the choan, and I think that's just because that's been an area that's just been consistently inundated with blooms for the past, 8 years or so. And I think, the folks out there, they just sort of come to know that it's going to happen every summer. They've gotten used to it, but they still alert us to it. And so I think it depends on if you've had blooms in the past. You're kind of prepared for it more than, for example, like Wylie that hasn't had it in the past. People weren't really sure what to do with it. So I think, again, having them in the past kind of helps to get folks more educated on what they are.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. Okay, let's see. First question that came up in the chat earlier in the presentation comes from Michael. Have you studied the use of cyanobacteria as fertilizers, since they have the ability to fix nitrogen gas into nitrogen products that plants can use? Well, sounds like that might be sort of outside the DWR purview.
Right. I mean, I hope people do find a commercial use for algal blooms, because that would be very useful, especially for cleanup. But yeah, that is more, I mean, every so often people will ask us questions like that, or biofuel or stuff like that. And I don't know, I would have to get on the internet and read up about stuff like that. But no, we don't really do experimental applications or anything like that.
Gotcha. Let's see. Troy had a couple of questions. What kind of fish are most likely to be killed by algae blooms?
Dan, do you have ideas?
Yeah, I was gonna say I'm not sure. We do have another group here that we work with that deals with the fish kills. I'd have to follow up with them, but just looking through some of the reports that we've gotten, it can obviously depend on what fish are in the area. I'm not 100% sure on this, but I would think the more susceptible species would be the ones that are affected by it. But I don't have an answer for the specific ones that would be affected by it.
I mean, given the impacts to like oxygen in the water that these blooms can have, it's sort of like, I don't know, any fish that needs oxygen, and or maybe certain water temperatures, because these algae can impact the ecology of those systems pretty heavily if they get large. The next question here was, how safe are algaecides for the environment?
People ask us about this too, and basically I am not interested in killing the algae, even though I understand that other people would be. Pretty much you can dump various chemicals into the water to kill algae that might have knock-on effects that would just be unpleasant down the road, and also it won't get rid of any algal toxins which may be present. And so I would worry about that, because you could get rid of the microcystis, so to speak, but then you don't have the green water there to warn you that toxins are possibly in the water. And then you might have toxic properties of the algaecides that you're using. So while I'm not an expert in that field, I'd be very, very careful about what you do with that.
Excellent stuff. Okay, the next one that I've got for you here, you might be drawing on some of your collaborations with DHHS for this one, but do you have any information on the number of adverse health effects from exposure to algal or cyanobacterial species? How likely is an adverse health reaction?
Well, I know, as Elizabeth mentioned, usually we don't have many of those recorded here in North Carolina. Again, as I mentioned right then, it depends on if it's actually been recorded or not. I know there is a website that DHHS does upload health effects to. It's run by a national organization. I can't remember right now. But I don't think that there have been many again, reported adverse health effects for blooms. That would, again, as you mentioned, be a question for DHHS.
We'll email Kennedy about that one from your slide. Okay, let's see. You mentioned the importance of collaboration. Can you tell us some ways you work with community groups and university scientists?
Often, researchers will contact us saying, "Hey, what's going on?" Especially when they want to write a grant. And I had a couple of people at NOAA, which is a federal lab. They said, "Okay, so what's going on? We're going to write a grant." I said, "Go to the Chowan River and talk to them." And of course, when the Chowan-Edenton Environmental Group said that they were having problems, unfortunately, they're in a black hole as it concerns algal research. They're not close to a university that studies algae. They're not close to any of our regional offices. And I said, if you can actually collect your own samples and get together with NOAA's phytoplankton monitoring network, that would help a lot. So they did. And so they've been working with that federal organization to actually do their own, monitoring. And lately, last week, they sent us some pictures and said, "Hey, we're finding some Dolichospermum or Anabana, and so this is coming." And so our regional office went out there on Monday and collected samples. Also, we'll see something that we think is weird, and of course, like Dan and I both came out of graduate labs at NC State, and we see something strange, we might email or call somebody and say, "Hey, this is going on, FYI, what do you think?" And so we all start talking to each other.
Yeah, and for the Lake Wylie group too, that is there are many different stakeholders in that group. And so, as I mentioned, we have state government, local government, Duke Energy, health departments involved with that. And so that's been a really great learning experience just to see how other groups interact with blooms and how they deal with it too.
Interesting stuff. In the time that we've got left, a couple of moments here, a comment came in. This user wrote that they've seen portions of the Cape Fear that looked like green paint from horizon to horizon, which sounds like a big bloom.
Yeah, that's in 2009, we started getting really big blooms of Microcystis on the Cape Fear. And people were saying that, "Oh, I've been on the water for 20, 30 years. I've never seen this." So, yeah, I'm not surprised that the Cape Fear could be having algal blooms. And it's one river that we do look at regularly.
So how often are water samples coming into the lab for you to analyze? Or how often are you sending out for samples to get into the lab with?
Well, I get samples every month from around the state. Every month I'll get samples from Jordan Lake, Falls of News Reservoir, several of the coastal rivers, and then every summer the Department of Environmental Quality has to look at every river basin every 5 years, and we have about 17 river basins. So that means every summer our intensive survey branch goes out and they look at, so okay, we're going to look at all these river basins this summer, and this summer we're going to look at all these lakes in these river basins, and I'll get all of those samples. So I'm not looking at the Cape Fear now, but I think we did the Cape Fear Basin last year or the year before. But we'll look at, if we don't, and unless we get a bloom, we'll look at a bloom whenever we get it. But, pretty much we look at the Cape Fear Basin every 5 years.
And so do you have to, with the number of samples that are coming in, do you ever have to prioritize where the resources go? Because an area, like we've talked about the Chowan, right, is really sort of rising in interest and priority. Are there places like particular lakes that you just always have to make sure you're keeping an eye on and communicating with DHHS or other partners about?
Yeah, I personally have not, I tell people I haven't hit the wall and when it comes to algal samples yet, but the holdup comes with, enough people being able to go out on the water and collect the samples. And so that's all comes down to what the intensive survey branch and what the regional offices can say. So like, they'll prioritize algal blooms, especially if somebody is saying, hey, we've got a problem here, but people just there has to be the resources for people to get out on the water and collect those samples. And that's the holdup that we find. But it comes down, and pretty much priority goes to algal blooms and also just of course I said the 5-year river basin monitoring we do every summer.
Right. So let's see. The website again, I'm going to make sure I got it right, was algae.nc.gov.
Yes.
Awesome. Well, folks, resources there available for you. If you think you see an algae bloom, you've now met 2 great people to get in touch with, who it sounds like would love nothing more than to get to know your algae blooms. So, Elizabeth, Dan, it's great to have you on the team here in North Carolina.
Well, I'm just glad I have a job studying algae. So it's my niche.
Yeah, thank you. It's great. It's really interesting to see what's out there.
Excellent stuff. Thanks to you both for being on the Lunchtime Discovery Series today. Viewers, thanks for tuning in to today's program as well. Of course, we'll be back here next week with another edition of the Lunchtime Discovery Series, so make sure you've got your calendars marked. You can also sign up for the Environmental Education email newsletter for the Lunchtime Discovery Series, where you'll get a weekly reminder about the upcoming program, as well as reminders about what's happening for the next month's worth of programs. Head to eenorthcarolina.org, and you can sign up for that there and see what's coming up next. You can also check out the calendar of events for the museum. We're naturalsciences.org, where we have this program and many others that you can take advantage of in person and virtual. Make sure that you're also following everybody on the social medias. The museum is at Natural Sciences on all major platforms, and you can find the Office of Environmental Education as well at North Carolina EE on Facebook and Twitter. Until next time, everybody, take care, stay safe, keep an eye out for those algae blooms, take pictures and samples and send them in. Follow the instructions at algae.nc.gov, I suppose. And we'll see you again real soon. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.